it's hard to know where to start.
I know.
We haven't got a script, eh?
Yeah, you
it's
gotta-
in all in our head.
Yeah.
But when Jewel was talking to me about it, I said, "Oh yeah, I know. Dad took me fishing over there at the old Meatworks jetty one day, and we didn't go onto the jetty itself. I think it was old and decrepit then, so we just fished beside it on the sort of a bit of a sand bank."
Can I stop for 1 second? Your watch is
Rattling.
making a lot of noise. Can we just take it off?
And anyway, what happened was he threw the line out for me, and he used to use a big line. Dad, 80-pound break and strain, and big hook and big bait. So when I hooked something, it was the big thing. You know, I was only about, I might have been 10 or 11. So this thing was about 6 foot long. Big shovel-nosed shark. And so it was going like that in the water, and I couldn't. I said, "Mate, you better pull this in." I said, "Too strong for me." Anyway, he pulled it in. So that was my first fish and my last fish with him. I decided that he had too much patience for me, and his favourite spot was just down here at a place called Salmon Rocks, where the Ports Corporation has built this new facility here, this coal facility, and he'd spend a lot of his fishing time there. So he used to come down at the right tide, and he'd fish the incoming tide, and he'd fish the outgoing tide, and then he'd come home. And I couldn't sit there for that amount of time, no way. And but he'd always come home with a fish, usually about nearly as long as this table, big king salmon, and my job was to clean it when he brought it home. And that was the only part of the fishing that I liked. Was I'd have an opportunity to scale this fish and gut it, and then he'd come down and get the axe and chop it into chunks, and then and put it into a bag, and I'd take it around to different relatives around the area and drop a piece of this big salmon off. So they'd get maybe a chunk like that, which would feed a lot of people when you cook up a pot of rice or some vegetables with it. And so he was a bit of a fisherman as well, the old fella, and in between times of getting us a feed off from the ocean, he was working at the meatworks, and so we had, you know, all the boys had and girls, I suppose, who worked out there had access to cheap meat, and so we lived pretty freely in those days from compared to today, from our people working on those particular areas. But and it was like seasonal work. A lot of our relations used to come from Bundaberg and other places and work here for the killing season, and so we always had visitors around the place. So it was like an unwritten law for those particular people who came from out of town. They'd always come to Dad's place first. Well, we've got to go to Uncle Hector's, and they usually came by train most of those times, so they found their way over there either by taxi or walk over to just up the road here, Barney Street, and then they'd all set up camp over there at the Happy Valley, they used to call it. It was the railway dam, and so they made it it was like an unwritten rule that the first place they visited, even when the seasonal work wasn't going on, or they were travelling past Gladstone, going north or going south, they'd have to come to Uncle Heck's place. And so that's how we got to meet and see a lot of them. We didn't know who a lot of them were, as being kids. Names never attached us to them as such, but the fact that we knew they were relatives of some sort, some description. And so over the years there was literally, dozens. And some would stay for a night, some would stay for a week, and some stayed a lot longer.
Yep.
And so Mum became the hostess of the place. She'd cook and feed them, and then organise for beds and mattresses and all that sort of stuff. and that was because of Dad. And Mum played the faithful wife, and she was happy to do it. She never complained about Dad's habit of bringing people home, or indeed, so he'd be downtown at the pub, might be, and he'd run into someone down there. And next minute a taxi would show up at home. A stranger getting out of the cab, maybe Reggie Littlemore or Mr. Coughlin or someone, would drop them off at the front door, and they'd come around the back stairs and knock on the wall, and and anyway, Uncle Heck said to come around here and have a clean up and have a shower and a shave and have a feed, and might be able to get a bed for the night. And so that used to happen regularly. So a lot of that sort of connection to people became apparent to us younger ones, that was the done thing. And so this sort of same thing happened in a lot of other of our families around the state as well, where you'd go and visit and they'd always put on a feed, and everybody have a yarn. And a lot of the time though, these old fellas, when they first got together, there'd be 2 or 3 of them, and one bloke in particular used to come through the front gate, and Dad would see him and he'd see Dad, and they both start crying. I'm thinking, what are these old fellas up to? This crying for one another, and then hugging one another, and talking a bit of lingo. And anyway, they'd all head down the backyard, sit underneath a ponciana tree or somewhere like that, the old mulberry tree or whatever, and have a chat. So I wasn't part of the conversation. I was allowed to sit to the back, just behind them, making sure I wasn't too conspicuous. Anyway, I used to listen to them talk about things, and a lot of the stuff was in lingo that I couldn't really understand, and I'd pick up a word or two here and there, and so these old guys would have a big laugh, and then later in the afternoon they'd head back upstairs, and Mum would have the food cooked, and they'd all sit around the table and laugh and carry on and have a sing-song. Someone would come with a guitar, or they had a guitar there, or whatever, someone to supply the music. Sometimes Juliri would play the piano, and I think Jackie had an accordion at the time, and she'd supply the music. So it was a time of celebration, I suppose, every time someone came. So it was a big thing for us, and because of that, because a lot of the things about Dad we didn't know. He never really told us much about what he'd done. It was always someone else who'd tell us, and so around this particular area here, we like Julie probably told you, we spent a lot of time down here at the front beach, and we used to drag a net, or throw the line in or something like that, but always catch some fish or get some prawns, or and even some crabs from time to time. So it was amazing, early days of our growing up over here at Barney Point. The main part of Barney Point for us was the back beach. There was more food resources there. Crabs were more plentiful, and all the kids in the neighbourhood, let me tell you, must have been 30 kids here in those days, and or more, and they all used to fish out of Piggery Creek, and Piggery Creek wasn't very big. It might have been from here to the point over there and the other side of that pool, and it wasn't very wide, maybe here to that, at its widest, here to the fence, and but all covered around mangroves everywhere, and at high tide it was like a beautiful playground, and that's what we used it for. So when the tide was out, it was mud. There was mud everywhere, all over us, and we'd be pulling crabs out of the crab pots and out of the crab holes, and then we used to take around the the neighbourhood and sell them for about 20 cents each. And we were happy. We thought that was a great price. So today you won't buy one for $30. And so it was a lot different for us. You know, people used to exist on the selling mud crabs, and so there was a couple of old fishermen over there. Old Charlie, what was his last name?
I remember old Peggy.
Yeah, old Peggy, he had him as well, but Charlie Porteous and old Bob Dix, they were all fishermen. A lot of the other guys worked on the railways, so they all got on pretty well. You know, there was leaders amongst them, and Dad was one of those leaders, I suppose, where it come to relationships between the different cultures.
Well, he was a fighter all his life. He was actually chased by the police, and I do have a piece of paper at home given to me by my cousin Mervyn. So Dad, the police were looking for him. They said he was a cheeky black fella, and they was trying to get him. And that was just south of here, around the Mirring Vale, and they were trying to catch up, but they couldn't catch him because he was one step ahead of them. So he had to end up leaving town. That's why he went to Mackay, way back in the late 30s, and because they were sending a lot of the people that were standing up for their rights, because he actually stood up for his rights when he was a younger, and in Mirring Vale, and he wasn't allowed in town. After the curfew of 6 o'clock, he could be in town all day, but he wasn't allowed because he wanted to have a drink with his mates and his white mates and everybody in the township. And they said, "You've got to leave now." And he said, "Well, I'm not going anywhere. This is my country here. Why should I leave? I'll fight any man." They said, "Okay, we'll get our best fighter." So they got this big white fella. They made the boxing ring up there in Mirring Vale under the big fig tree. And they got their best fighter, big, strapping young man he was. And white fella. So Dad was only a little skinny black fella in the days, and he never ever put on much weight. But he fought that fight and he won it. So they said, "Well, you can come and stay in town after 6 now," seeing you fought that fight. So we've been told this story too by old white men in Mirring Vale. They know this about the story. So he was fighting all his life for the rights before native title, and it was ironic that he died in 1993 when it all came out, you know. But Dad was a fighter all his life, and that's so we feel very strongly, and we've carried on that in a different way. But I know we can't fight with our fists, but that happened in the past too. Even when we were school kids, we had to fight because we were different. And
So the fight was not with a policeman; it was just with a local guy that was.
No, the
upholding
police told him to get out of town.
Right.
Because the law was in all over Australia. There was a boundary road set up all over Australia.
Yeah.
See, a lot of towns and cities, they've got the boundary road, and they weren't allowed in there. And like they'd be working in town here even for the white fellas, but after a certain time they'd have to leave town. Like all little towns along the coast, all over Australia. This part of the racism, I guess, and society. So hold your place. Go back to the bush where you belong. You know.
Dad had a favourite saying back in the 70s, and it was, "This is my land. You haven't paid me for it yet." And so that later on in the fight for rights and land, it became popular down south where big signs done up, pay the rent, you're on Aboriginal land. And so Dad sort of preceded that in his own way, and so I think he didn't make for good relationships with a lot of people in the community because of Dad's strong will, and he opened his mouth up in the most inappropriate places, and I think we did that ourselves as well today. But what I found over the years, and I'm nearly 70 now, but I can see throughout history, since I was 17 18, how different sections of this community here in Gladstone have sort of disenfranchised us from being part of the community. A lot of the stuff that we do is almost tokenism, and so when I look back and I see things that have happened over the years, and I think, this is all gammon stuff. These fellas, they're treating us like dummies, Another great old saying in Australia is, we're like the bird on the bicky tin. We're there for decoration. We're not inside of it. So what it means to us is that tokenism is really about making it look to the outside world as we treat our blacks, they're good, blah blah blah. But it's their problem that they're living in the conditions that they live in. But we want them to be first and foremost. But they never want to put you inside the bicky tin where you're part of the what would you call it, the product. The product in Australia is Aboriginal culture, and every day we see more and more. It's leaning back to, especially when we talk about environmental care and about bushfires and those sorts of things, and especially where housing developments and councils have built housing estates in flood-prone areas. The blackfellas were telling them, don't build there. That floods every, maybe 50 or 100 years, but they're prepared to take that risk. The councils and people who come and buy, they don't know none of that history, and so they're actually creating a place where people will suffer hardship unduly because of the truth has been hidden from them. And so so Dad was against all that sort of stuff, and he thought that, someone was doing the wrong thing, he'd let them know. And so we've sort of grown up with that sort of attitude, that if someone's perpetuating a lie that's not really the truth, then hey, I think you'll find that that's not right, and this is what really happened there. So a lot of people in Gladstone, and we were the same as a lot of places, especially these smaller places. There was only half a dozen families, Aboriginal families, and you could name them, and most of them were related in some way, shape or form. And so there was never much opportunity for the old traditional ways to continue. So our marriage ways and relationships, they were sort of broken up because of the dispersal of the tribes. Mm-hmm. So within our group, we were fortunate in a way that we've been able to maintain a strong nucleus of apical connections. So those apical connections were identified during the native title process, where people had to nominate their connection to particular groups, and so it's interesting to note that in the makeup of our native title claim, there was 4 groups, and the 14 groups had 17 apical ancestors that they nominated, that took them back to the time of colonisation and first contact. And out of those 4 groups, one has 1 apical connection, another one has one has 2 apical family connections, and our particular group has 13. And yet, by native title, the way native title works, we got the least voice. We get no say, because these 3 here, working through the European system of voting, they outvote us. So not only has our way of life been destroyed by colonisation, our black people today are using the European version of rules and debate and company organisational strategy to dispossess this group over here again.
The biggest group.
So the oppressed have become the oppressors. and they're oppressing their own. So that's what native title has done. The native title was never the invent of Aboriginal people. It was a government program set about to appease the powers that be in the the cattlemen and the farmers and all that sort of stuff. They were the ones who stood to lose the most if native title became legal in that sense. But you haven't looked back now that native title has occurred. Who's lost their property? No one. They were talking about, you have to close your pools down, the schools and hospitals, and the black fellas will take everything away. Hasn't happened. And maybe that's because of John Howard's plan, bucket loads and bucket loads of extinguishment. So Tim, old mate Tim, I forget his last name.
Fisher.
Tim Fisher, that he was talking about. So if Dad had been alive today, I don't know how he would have. He would have sat in the corner and cried, I think. But so what we've got to do is make the most of a bad situation, and we can't get angry. They say get even. Don't get angry, get even. But I think we've just got to use our smarts. We've got to get our young people educated without losing their First Nation values, right? So we've got a couple of our kids going through uni at the moment, which is always good. We've got a couple of the oldest, Juliri and my generation. There's 3 or 4 of them have university degrees. But that came about because of a Labor government and a Prime Minister who was a bit forward thinking, Gough Whitlam. I think Dad loved Gough. He thought the sun shone out of Bob Hawke's behind, but history has made us realise that they weren't the real heroes either. The heroes came out of our own ranks, people like Vincent Lingiari, those sorts of people, the people from Yothi,
Hector
India.
Johnson, and he was our hero because he's always stood up for his rights wherever he was. He never lost his sense of identity, and the fight was always in him. Yet he had the culture there. Look, when we were growing up, Richard didn't mention our granny was living with us because she died in 1956. Our aunties and uncles lived with us. We had a 4-bedroom house there, but we only had like a main bedroom and a sleep out when all the other cousins. So that Aboriginal cultural values came in there because we were looking after one another, and they'd always have a bed, they'd always have a feed at our house because that was our way. We never saw not others doing that. Our neighbours, they just had their family, all the white fellas. They never had family coming in like us. We could name hundreds and hundreds that came to our house.
Like you, I open my eyes in amazement at the things that they say about that sort of thing, yet can't take that step further and say this is what our Aboriginal brothers and sisters must have felt when the first fleet landed in Australia or in this country, and how people were dispossessed at the stroke of a pen or at the there's a lot of talk about Cook's log and how he was supposed to engage with the native people in this area, and the report that he took back to the King about an empty land, terra nullius, and how things progress from there. So all these things that are affecting people today, especially socially and economically and environmentally, with there's a lot more non-Indigenous people saying we should have been practicing the land care techniques and strategies of the Aborigines, and especially in fire management. And there's some good books available, and I haven't read I've got to admit I haven't read either of them, but there's a book called something about the black emu,
Dark emu.
the dark emu, yeah, and
Yeah, heard of it.
and another one it's called the greatest estate on earth,
Yeah.
and I've read excerpts of each, and what both these guys talk about is how Europeans, especially some of those first explorers, when they wrote their reports, they talked about the type of grass, type of trees, and the animals that were seemed to be drawn to a particular area because of those grasses and trees. And Aboriginal people managed those estates by making sure that those trees and those types of grasses were available in specific types of areas, so that it was easier for them to access on the hunt and to provide for their families. So, and just today, you still see some Europeans who are trying to discredit those writers and trying to overturn the thinking that these guys have taken from the excerpts of these explorers' records, and they talk about Aboriginal dwelling places, farmlands, as far as the eye could see. There were particular types of crop growing, and yet if you read the statements from some parts of history, they say, oh, they deserved to own the land. They didn't farm it, and they didn't till it. They weren't builders. They done none of this stuff. Yet there's evidence there that shows that we were farming fish, oysters, clams, all those sorts of foods, using a technology that might be ancient but still prove adequate today for the purposes of, if they wanted to share and trade off with other groups, they could, then they did. Amazing how our societies were described as being primitive and Neanderthal, basically, and yet there's all this evidence today that shows a different side of the equation, and I think Dad was caught between the old and the new, and he should have lived 100 years earlier. He would have enjoyed that. I don't know that he would have made it today, because he had so much anger, and maybe the anger was caused by what happened back there. But his father was a different man to Dad. His father was able to communicate and take advantage of opportunities that arose from time to time, whereas Dad was he was a different sort of a man. He was clever in his own way. We had in our tribal history, we've got a man who was considered to be the special person in our tribe, the clever man, and his name was Gamimi. That's his tribal name. It means clever person, so he could be male or female, but I think we're more of a patrilineal group than a matrilineal group, and so although all of our apical ancestors, bar two, I think, are women, but that's a statement about how colonisation affected our tribe and in Australia, especially the East Coast, essentially. Not a lot of men were left able to care for their families. They were ostracised, murdered, poisoned, whatever, got rid of, and so the women had to take the front line. So where was I going with that? Was that Dad, if he had been able to get the right education in a white man's world, I don't know what he could have been, but I don't even know what age, grade of school he went to. I know that all of his uncles and all of his brothers and sisters never had much of a education. So yeah, Dad was completely different to me in that sense. I do things differently to him.
In what sense?
Well, in the sense that Dad, you know, if he didn't like what you said, or seen a couple of people down the street beating someone up or something like that, he'd get involved. Whereas I'd be more inclined to be the peacemaker, you know. So, in that sense, I'm a little bit different. Maybe that's because of my mum's over the years, her the connection I had to her and her culture. I seen Mum say to us when we were kids, "Mum, what does that word mean?" And she'd say, "Not my place to tell you. But this is what it means." So, and you can't say that word because it's not proper for you to say that word. And so, and a lot of Aboriginal people who came to our house over the years, Mum knew more about our language than they did, you know, because their tribal education had been disrupted. Alcohol was introduced, you know, that needless fighting and that sort of stuff was prevalent. They all had the ability to work. They were all good workers, strong, hard workers. Like, you know, when the development of Gladstone was going on, we never really understood why these new people to Gladstone were buying up as much land as they could. Well, all you need is just a small block to live in, a house or whatever. But they were buying a lot of land, and you know, they'd done well out of Gladstone. But we never really understood. Our European friends never even said to us, "This is an opportunity for you. Gladstone's going to develop into this sizable sort of a city, and you can prepare your family for the future, so that you've got an asset base where you can get your kids educated. You know, if you have health issues and that sort of stuff, there's always this opportunity. You can use your house as collateral or your land as collateral. None of that. What's that? You know."
Wasn't our culture. That's that divide, eh? Wasn't our culture. Probably still isn't.
So anyway, yeah. So that, like I said, Dad probably lived 50 to 100 years too late. He should have been around earlier. He would have really had a good time. So Gamimi, the guy I was talking about, he had in our tribal way, we understood him to be sort of a magic man. We only talked about this the other day. The stagecoach come through Lomead, and Gamimi was sitting on the post office steps as the stagecoach went past him, and they waved to him and he waved to them back. When they got to Miriam Vale, which is about 70 k's up the road, you know, about 40 miles, and old dirt tracks in those days, here he was sitting on the veranda at the pub, like waving to him. And he couldn't work it. It may have taken him a couple of hours to get there, but he was there before them. He had to travel the same route. Whether he knew another route that he could go, I don't know. But that's one of the stories about Gamimi. He also had a talking spear that was in the I think it was in the Queensland University at one time. We don't know where it's got to.
It was in the Bundaberg Museum at one stage.
Yeah, in the early days with those rocks.
But don't know what's happened to it. We need to find out more.
Right, but Gamimi is an important man
Clever
culturally
man,
to our mob, and I suppose he was our great grandmother, who was our apical ancestor. He was her brother, so he's our great uncle. So not long ago, I'm sure you know a few of your great uncles, and probably your great greats. Like I was only talking to someone yesterday or the day before about their families, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's my great grandson's grandson." I'm thinking, still alive, and here they are meeting their great grandfathers. I didn't even meet my grandfather, both of them. So it's hard for me to sort of comprehend.